Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Once again to another episode of Mike's on Mike. I'm Mike Miller. Nice to have you with us. Mike Hightower, of course, is with us here in studio. Mike Tolbert is back at his farm, and we've got a special guest joining us today, and we're delighted to have her with us. This is Mari Koryaishi. I hope I got that correct. President of the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund. And thank you so very much for joining us and coming here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before Mari had moved to Jacksonville to join the fund, she co-founded the Crowdfunding Philanthropy Global Giving. Do us a favor. Give us some background on that a little bit, because I understand that really had some bearing on you moving to Jacksonville, correct?
Can we do that? How about a quick bio? Give us a little idea of how you got, where you started, how you got there.
Okay. I am Japanese, born in Japan. I happened to, my parents moved around, so I grew up in Italy, Japan, and Germany before landing here. Came here for college, became a Sovietologist. That dates me. I went to graduate school, studied Soviet history, Soviet politics, Soviet economics. And then in the midst of my degree, the Soviet Union fell apart and political science failed to predict that was going to happen. And I was like, I think it's time for me to get a job.
That's interesting.
I went and got a job at the World Bank, which was... I knew nothing about the World Bank, but they were looking for Russia specialists. And I showed up there and got to have an amazing career working on Russian liberalization, privatization, democracy. I was Russia country officer, and then ended up doing some corporate strategy work for the World Bank, at which point we, my co-founder and I, sort of figured out that there were ways in which the international development industry could innovate, and it wasn't going to happen in the World Bank. So we should leave the World Bank and start this crowdfunding platform. And that was at the end of 2000. Seemed like a good time, right? That was the first .com boom.
Right.
Followed very shortly by
the recession, of course.
By the .com bust, right? Timing is everything. But we had started Global Giving by then. There were a couple lean years, but we, made our way through it, and it is now a crowdfunding platform that has delivered over $900 million to 175 different countries, 30,000 plus organizations around the world, from million donors and up. And that was premised on the idea that there were lots of great ideas in the world, but not always the resources to realize them. And so we wanted to come up with a platform to figure out how to get resources there. And we figured that the internet would provide a way for people to become as familiar with the orphanage in Rwanda as they would be with the Boy Scout troop down the street. And by leveraging people's sense of proximity through the internet, we could get resources there. And so what Global Giving does is it vets these organizations, makes sure that they're so legit, promotes the communication between donor and recipient, and gives donors a lot of choices about where they can put their money.
How is that part determined?
They choose where they're
going to put the money, and you facilitate it.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. Right.
So that's Global Giving.
That's Global Giving. And it's still going strong today. And are you still a part of it, even though you're
on the board?
You're on the board. Okay.
And then you got from there to here.
Yes. I was recruited to head up the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund, and thought it was a interesting gig. It is.
It is
an interesting gig.
Mr. Tolbert?
Yeah, let's start with some basics. Tell us who Jessie Ball DuPont was, and tell us a little bit of the history of the fund.
Sure. Jessie Ball DuPont was the third wife of Alfred I. DuPont. And Alfred I. DuPont is part of that famous DuPont family, gunpowder, chemicals, that company. She got married to Alfred when she was 39. By that point, she was the vice principal of a high school out in California. She had been supporting her family. And the Ball in her name refers to the Ball family of the northern neck of Virginia. You may recall that George Washington's mother was a Ball,
Right.
Mary Ball Washington, same Ball family. So, Mayflower, blue blood, daughter of the American Revolution. The Ball family has a long lineage. She and Alfred did not have children, and she became his business partner and confidant. And as you can see from the fact that she was, the vice principal of a high school, by the time she got married to Alfred, she was, a professional woman. And by then, even though she didn't have a whole lot of money, had developed habits of philanthropy. She got into the habit of supporting students that came through her schools to go to college. And so she had been doing what she could to support students. She believed strongly that education was an escalator for social and economic mobility, and that this was an important thing to do. Now, when she married Alfred, she had access to a lot more funds. And in her lifetime, she gave away more than, what in today's dollars would be $100 million. So she was a generous philanthropist, a woman who, took part in business decisions alongside her husband as well as her brother, Ed Ball, and practiced philanthropy in her lifetime and set aside money upon her death to set up what is now the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund. She was also a committed segregationist, and she, in her philanthropy, made choices that indicated she gave to many of the institutions that she thought would hold the line against integration. And she felt very strongly that, if integration was followed through, the world would fall apart.
Can you tell us what years we're talking about here? Because obviously that was certainly a period of our history, but what years are we talking about here when it comes?
So Brown versus Board of Education is in 1954, right?
Mm-hmm.
Her will states that we can give to the organization she gave to between 1960 and 1965. Right. So that's 300 plus organizations on that list. And many of, especially in the educational space, they represent her judgment about how important it was for white children to go to school with only other white children. Not only were there higher ed institutions on the list, there were segregation academies, which it's a sort of term of art. Academies that were set up in the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education decision to allow white families to continue to send their kids to schools that were limited to white students. Those are segregation academies. And so one famous one is in Prince Edward County in Virginia, the Fuqua School today, it's called. Back then it was known as Prince Edward Academy. She was one of the funders who helped stand that school up. And in Prince Edward County, they closed the public schools rather than integrate them.
The 64 Civil Rights Act must have really thrown a wrench into that whole thought process.
Yeah. I mean, because even as private institutions, you could no longer keep segregation. And so this is one of the things we are, sort of digging into, trying to understand the parameters of her grant making and the extent to which she may have harmed people in her grant making, notwithstanding the incredible generosity. Some of it was designed to exclude, and trying to figure out what we can do to repair some of those harms. What's been interesting is that, those institutions at the time were holding fast against integration. That included institutions like the University of the South. Today, fast forward decades later, the University of the South is having its own reckoning. Stratford Hall, the birthplace of Robert E. Lee, which she also played a very major hand in rescuing, was a institution that originally was designed to sort of glorify Robert E. Lee and his family, Harry Lightfoot Lee and Robert E. Lee. Today, it is a place where you can learn about everyone who set foot in Stratford Hall, not just the Lee family. And for many years, there were far more African Americans who went through Stratford Hall than the white owners of Stratford Hall. So each of these institutions that she picked back then is on its own journey around unpacking its legacy. And, we're lucky to be able to support those organizations as they sort of come to terms with it, because we're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah. Mike?
I'm still just taken aback by what she said. All right. So given what you're attempting to do with the Jessie Ball Fund, and given what her priorities were, and then given all the neat things that you're doing now, how have you thread that needle? So when you got here, I'm speaking as I shared with you earlier, I'm one of those folks that when I got to Jacksonville, or when we finally heard about Jessie Ball, it was like talking about Mother Teresa. And I don't mean that to be disrespectful, but all the things she did. But now, given your background, given what you have accomplished before you got here, and now in charge of this, how have you been able to thread that needle so successfully? Because I know we're going to be asking you about some of the things that the fund has done. How have you been able to thread that needle? Which shows great leadership, but how have you been able to do it?
There's a narrative through line to this. She cared very much about where she came from. She was a proud Virginian.
Right.
When, in addition to the organization she gave to between 1960 and 1964, there's another clause in her will that says we can give for the temporary relief of people in need in Florida, Virginia, and Delaware. Now, she could have chosen to write a will that says, I care about higher ed. I used to be a vice principal of a high school, and I think, education is the path to prosperity. She didn't do that. She made reference to the states of Florida, Virginia, and Delaware. And I think it shows a real attachment to place. Well, when I first went to the Northern Neck to sort of visit grantees up there, Northern Neck of Virginia, that is, we drove through Epping Forest. Now, for those of you who live here in Jacksonville, Epping Forest is the mansion on the St. Johns River that used to be her and Alfred's house, that is now a club and all that. We know Epping Forest as that beautiful house on the river. She remembered Epping Forest as this location up in the Northern Neck of Virginia. And that in turn, of course, refers to a place in England. But so she believed very strongly that place mattered. Take that and take her commitment to philanthropy and generosity. And I think our mission today makes sense. We build communities of belonging in the places and institutions that Jessie loved. So our intent is to double click on Jessie's commitment to place, but to say that we create communities of belonging in an attempt to redress her exclusionary tendencies that were manifest through racial segregation and her opposition to integration, because we today believe firmly that everyone has something to offer, but they don't bring solutions to the table unless they feel included. I mean, why should you get together to try and solve, problems like homelessness if you don't feel like you're included in the community? Well, let's do what we can to make people feel included, and we will leverage everyone's talent and creativity towards solving some of the problems that we have in our communities. And that to me is like the best way we can honor Jessie's love for the communities like Jacksonville.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Mr. Talbert?
Well, speaking of communities, Maury, I'd like to talk about LaVilla.
Mm-hmm.
LaVilla, we all know the word. We know the name LaVilla. We've heard it for years and years and years, but mostly we talk about it in the context of its history, and then hope for a promise. For people who don't know, LaVilla is adjacent to downtown and really part of downtown. It was a place where enslaved people escaped to and moved there at one point, and at another time in its history, it was where it was the Harlem of the South. It was considered the Harlem of the South, and it was where incredible musicians like Ray Charles and Dizzy Gillespie, and you can go on and on, where they performed. Yes. And how is the DuPont Fund involved in LaVilla, if you are?
We are involved in LaVilla, and it came about through a request from the city. Fairly early after I came here, the city said, can you help us make sure that this park that we're thinking about on the site of the Johnson brothers' homestead, where they were born and grew up, is a success and happens in the right way, in a way that includes the community in the decision-making process. So we said, yeah, that sounds great. We're committed to placemaking. We think public spaces where diverse people can come together and learn about each other is one of the ways in which we create communities of belonging. So that's straight up our alley. The city is a grantee, so we can do this work. And, as I got engaged in the work and Lift Every Voice and Sing, and, when Parks and Rec identified Walter Hood, MacArthur award-winning genius, urban landscape designer, to design the park, we held a lot of conversations around what should be in the park. We made sure to include Lloyd Washington, who was the person who pushed for decades to have this park come to life. We also went and fundraised for it. But what was so amazing about getting involved in Lift Every Voice and Sing is that history that you make reference to, Mike. It was the Harlem of the South. It became that because during the Civil War, the Union soldiers, many of whom were escaped slaves, were bivouacked in LaVilla at Fort Hatch. And when the war was over, notwithstanding the fact that they were, say, part of the Massachusetts 54th, they weren't going to go back to Massachusetts. It's too cold up there, right? They want to stay south. And they're like, well, we're demobbed here in Jacksonville, so let's go back to where we were bivouacked, Fort Hatch, which then becomes LaVilla, and ultimately the railroad station comes right into LaVilla. For a while, it was the southernmost point of the Eastern Seaboard Rail. So you even see that story in James Weldon Johnson's novel, autobiography, A Next Colored Man. He sort of ends up in Jacksonville because it's the end of the line. Mm-hmm. And he rolls out and gets a job being a lecturer at a Cuban-American cigar factory, right? He learns to read Spanish, and he's reading the news in the Cuban cigar factory, which is to say that part of town, in addition to all the artistic firm, it had Cubans, it had Chinese, railway workers, it had the formerly enslaved. The first synagogue in Jacksonville went up in LaVilla before it moved to Springfield and then ultimately down to Mandurah. So it was this multicultural hub that became, the Harlem. It had attracted all sorts of artistic people, Augusta Savage, Ray Charles from St. Augustine. And the idea that when you drive through LaVilla, it's like a whole bunch of grass lots, right? There's not much there because urban renewal did away with a lot of the built environment in LaVilla. How can we not lose the memory, the collective consciousness that this used to be this incredibly vibrant place? How can we recreate that feeling? The LaVilla School of the Arts being there is great. I can attest, my son went there. Their jazz bands are amazing.
Yep.
And, leveraging that talent, leveraging the fact that Lift Every Voice and Sing Park is going to be there. And then JTA's headquarters is right there.
And the Ritz, of course.
And the Ritz Museum and Theater is there. And now, we're beginning to see the model mile of the Emerald Trail going through there. Can we make sure that, and Stanton High School, the old Stanton High School is still there, and there are plans to renovate that too. Can we make sure that as the area revives, we retain that sense of history so that we don't forget that some of the most illustrious people who lived in Jacksonville lived right there in LaVilla? And, we want to recreate Augusta Savage's The Harp, which she pulled together for the World's Fair. There is no living sculpture left of the harp because she didn't have enough money to turn it into bronze. She just had a plaster version, 16 foot tall. And then the end of the fair, they just bulldozed it because, you can't move a plaster statue without, potentially damaging it.
Sure.
So wouldn't it be amazing for Jacksonville to recreate that and set it up somewhere in LaVilla so that we can remember Augusta Savage's sort of passage through LaVilla? And, there's just so much we could do to, it should be a source of pride for us.
You teed it up, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in on it. But as long as we're talking about statues for just a moment, can you tell us how does the fund get involved? How did they get involved in the whole Springfield Women of the South Memorial, and with the money that was donated privately going through you and I know forward? How did that all come about?
We actually have been in conversations with a number of city council presidents about the statue and what to do about it. Sam Newby, Terrence Freeman, and this was in part as the fund, but in also part through my involvement to the civic council, because the city council turned to the civic council and said, so how should we deal with the statue? And we said, why don't you hold some conversations? We, the fund, could pay for facilitated discussions. And we have some people from some universities that have done this, and, we'd be happy to do it. In the event, sort of life got in the way of having these conversations. And so when we were having the conversation with city council, the mayoral elections were going on. And in fact, Mayor Deegan had said she was going to take him down. That was one of her planks of her platform. Daniel also said that he wasn't going to use public money to take down the women of the Southland. So he wasn't as explicit about taking them down, but it wasn't entirely clear that he wasn't going to take them down. And so when we had an administration, because we had, been in conversations with the Curry administration, which then said, hey, by the way, the money is now under control of city council, so talk to city council, which is why we were talking to the president of the city council.
Right.
So when that happened and the mayor said, yes, I do intend to take it down, and I, like Daniel, don't want to use public funds for it, then we said, okay, then we will ask our trustees if we could take a role in funding the removal of that statue.
Mark, it's I think to somewhat answer Mike, even though we're supposed to only give observations, insights, and perceptions. It's really hard for us not to editorialize on that. But it kind of goes back to when you go back and talk about the vision or what Jessie Ball was trying to do about place. All right. You had the, quote, legislative and the executive saying, well, the money, and they're going back and forth. To me, it was, there you all were. You took a vision and the mission and you threaded the needle. It's about place. You found a way to take it off the table. I think when it's all said and done, I think Donna and the private sector who's helped you with this, they've done the city an incredible, I think they've done them a favor, because as our good friend Pam Paul, who's a great friend of the three of us, said, build a bridge, get over it, and move on. I mean, we got more important things to do. And, you know, you can Monday morning quarterback. And, you know, Mike Tolbert and I have been around 50 some odd years and watched this back and forth. But at some point you got to say, let's move on. And, you know, you can always say woulda, coulda, shoulda, the way it happened. But at the end of the day, it's moved on. There was a reason. And what we got to do is come together and move forward. Because some of the other projects.
Yeah. I love Pam too.
Yeah. She is a wonderful friend of us. Yeah. She's just been fantastic.
She'll be glad to hear all this.
Yeah, she really will.
She will be.
Can I change the subject quickly?
Yes,
that's a favorite line of his. If he doesn't say it at least once or so, we're in trouble. Go ahead, buddy.
Well, Mari, would you spend a couple of minutes telling us about the riverfront activation plan that you guys had put together? How did that happen, and what do you think the promise of that is?
Sure. So that's another instance where the city came to us and said, can you help us? We have a lot of public land on the riverfront. We believe that, you know, a good part of the riverfront is private. You know, there are private houses, clubs, whatever along the riverfront. But a good part of the land on the river in downtown is public. So we plan to have a number of signature parks along the river. We would like your help in figuring out what people want to do on the river. So we said, great. Again, it fits into what we believe around public spaces and creating the conditions for inclusion. So we worked with a couple of design consultants. We worked with Groundwork Jacks, who helped us reach out into the community. We ran surveys. We did events like walks along the river and river taxi rides, where we solicited people's opinions about what to do. And, you know, in the process, I too went out like into church basements on Wednesday evenings and sat down with the people and said, what would you like to do on the river? And there's a thick report that, you know, covers all our discoveries, but there are a number of challenges. People want to spend time on the river. They don't spend time on the river. And there's a question there to be unpacked. Is it because it's not easy to get to? Is it because the spaces that currently exist don't let them do what they want to do? I think it's a combination of all of those things. And what we ended up pulling together is a bunch of these insights, and DIA has adopted them as part of its overall plan. And it wasn't like this park should have these amenities. It was, these are the things people want to do. Let's ensure that some combination of all the parks allows people, top on the list, for instance, was we want to eat on the riverfront. And it came from 4-star dining to I want to be able to grill some hot dogs and hamburgers to have a family reunion on the river, right? So obviously we need to design for 4-star dining down to bring your own, barbecue stuff and have it on the river. To we want to be able to exercise on the river. We want to be able to meditate and just sort of absorb nature on the river. we want to bring our kids to the river, and, to bring kids, it has to be safe. There has to be something for them to do. Older people said, we want access to the river. So then we need to make sure that, it's not dangerous for people in a wheelchair to try and get to the river. So all of these things are included in the activation plan. And, I've been very pleased to see them integrated into the different plans that are coming together for Shipyards West, for Riverfront Plaza, and for the little music park that's near the Performing Arts Center. So a lot of different places are beginning to integrate that all. And when it can be all connected from Memorial Park to Metropolitan with an actual river walk, it'll be an amazing amenity for the city. And for those of us who aren't literally on the river, it'll be a way for us to enjoy the incredible river that is the St. Johns River.
That's awesome.
We're running out of time here, so Mr. Hightower's got the last
question. First, I think both the other two mics go, thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, thanks for being here. And this has been enlightening. And it's really good to see how you've brought this leadership and what you have done, and to be a full partner, both with the governmental, the private sector, and the nonprofit. Thank you. That's true leadership. So having said that, put you on the spot. Where do you see Jacksonville in the next 5 or 10 years, and why?
I think Jacksonville is going to continue to be on those listicles that say, 10 best places to move to or live in. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 30 years. When I showed up to Washington, D.C., the sidewalk rolled up at 5 p.m. There was, you could count the number of good restaurants in town in one hand. I mean, look at it today, right?
Yeah.
It is an amazing, vibrant city. And it all happened while I lived there. And, I moved to a neighborhood in D.C. that had like a crack house next door. By the time I left, there was a Warby Parker and a Trader Joe's. And, it had completely transformed. I think that transformation is possible here. I think the fact that work is increasingly hybrid means that people can choose to live wherever they want to live and still do the work they want to do. But I think if we create the conditions for people to be attracted to Jacksonville for affordability, for the arts, for its for the Emerald Trail, for kayaking on the river, right? For all of those things, when the talent shows up, the jobs will also show up. So, we invest in place. People will come to place. And then once we have the people, capital will follow. And we will see this virtuous cycle take off, that Jacksonville really has the potential to become amazing. And I say this in part because when I showed up here, there were amazing things in Jacksonville, like the Riverside Arts Market, like Porch Fest. It's one of those amazing music festivals that is free to the public. It's homegrown. Had one of the most integrated audiences I've seen at a musical event. And, gems like Sunray Cinema or, bakeries like Community Loaves. And the amazing thing was these places weren't mobbed the way those places would be mobbed in other cities.
Yeah.
So somehow we're not quite getting the information out. But when we begin to align all of that, and people discover how there are so many gems here in Jacksonville, I think, the floodgates will open. So when the talent shows up, the capital will follow.
I hope you brought your magic wand with you from Washington when you moved.
Mr. Tolbert, you get the last word.
Yes, sir. My last word is simply thank you so much. As Mike Hightower said, number one, for being here, but most especially for what you and the fund do.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen.
Mari, thank you.
Thank you, Mari, very much.
And thank your staff and your board for all that they're doing.
Absolutely.
Every day you
My
help it.
team is amazing, and they're the ones who make all this happen.
Well, it's about leadership.
you.
Starts at the top.
Come back and see us.
Come back.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about.
Really.
Thank you all very much for joining us with this episode of Mike's on Mike. We hope you'll catch us again next week. Once again, too, we want to thank our good friend Alan Bliss. And, I'd love to have a conversation with Mari and Alan. Between their knowledge of history of this community, it would be a fascinating
Particularly
conversation.
if they listened last week when he was talking about Jacksonville, what's our identity?
Right.
Given this
What Mari's just done.
That's right. Put the two of you all together. We need to do that.
I think we need to do that.
Do that.
Happy to do that.
We'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining
Thank
us.
y'all.
And have yourself a good week.
Y'all have a great time. Thank you, Mari, for being here.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.